It's also about the heart, and just like John was talking about earlier, they exist really just to try and convince people of the credibility of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that's why Ravi exists, and I know Logan is passionate about that too, and so would you please join me in welcoming Logan Gates.
Well, it's great to be with you guys tonight. I'm just really bad at all of these kind of games. Anyone else just like never win these games we just played? Yeah. No, I'm the only one. We got a few people in here. I'm just really glad for that one we didn't actually have to run to the corners, because you would have seen how much I would have lost every time. But it's great to be with you guys tonight. Great to be up in St. Marie. John has set us up so well for the topic we're diving into for this last part of tonight. John helped us see how, when it comes to what the culture says, it has an impact on what we feel is true and what we think is true. And the order works that way. And so in that sense, we've gotten a little more aware and perhaps a little more skeptical about always believing what people around us believe. But at the same time, this raises the question, if we're not supposed to do that, if the Bible is supposed to be the foundation of what you and I believe as Christians, why is that? Why should I trust the Bible? And I want to dive into this topic tonight through the story of this guy, C.S. Lewis. Anyone heard of C.S. Lewis here? Awesome. Any Narnia fans? Yes? You guys heard there's a new Netflix, being me, Chronicles of Narnia? Well, we'll hope they don't mess that up. But
Preach.
C.S. Lewis. I don't know if you know the story of C.S. Lewis's life. C.S. Lewis was born in Northern Ireland. He was born into a family that he would describe as Christian. Went to church from time to time. But growing up in Northern Ireland, he got the front row seat on religion at its worst. Maybe you all know in that part of the world, even sometimes still today, violence erupts between two kinds of believers. You have Catholics and Protestants, and they've been at odds with each other for centuries. Lewis grew up seeing that from firsthand. From there, he went on to be a fighter, soldier in World War I. His best friend died in that war. He saw evil and suffering close up. And it was a combination of those two experiences that led Lewis to leave his faith. He became an atheist. And with no Christian faith whatsoever, he entered into the University of Oxford. And he studied English. And he went on just to fall in love with ancient myths, particularly myths from cold places, cold like Sault Ste. Marie, but actually cold like Scandinavia. Vikings. I don't know if there are any Vikings here in Sault Ste. Marie, but those are the kind of myths that Lewis loved. And Lewis gradually began to realize that these myths always were about good and evil and heroes. And he began to realize this was an issue with his atheism. His atheism told him that good and evil, well, those were just feelings, the byproduct perhaps of evolution, but nothing more. There's nothing really good out there, no real ultimate good. It's just how maybe I feel, how I've been wired to feel, but there's nothing real behind that. Same with heroism. Why do we root for the underdog? Well, Lewis had to realize at the heart of all these stories he came to love was something his atheism couldn't really put words to. He couldn't call good good, or evil evil, or a hero hero. And Lewis began, once again, to be open to the idea of God. God would mean there was a point of absolute good. He could call good good and believe in a hero. But Lewis still didn't realize what Christianity, or a book written 2,000 years ago, could have anything to do with this. And it was at that point that Lewis met a guy named J.R.R. Tolkien. Any Tolkien fans out there? Yes, a few. Tolkien is the author of The Lord of the Rings. Kind of like my two favorite people. I wish I could have been there when they had these conversations. But both Lewis and Tolkien were part of a group of people called the Coal-Biter Society. And the Coal-Biters read these ancient Nordic myths. And it was in these Coal-Biter group meetings Tolkien suggested an idea to Lewis that would totally change the way Lewis thought about Christianity and the Bible. Tolkien suggested that Christianity was a myth, like all the other myths that Lewis loved so much. A myth that was about good and evil and spoke about heroes and gave him real hope and meaning as he read it. But here was a myth with one key difference. This was a myth that was really true. It was a myth written not just on the pages of a book, but on the pages of history. And it was a myth, Tolkien said, that was behind all other myths, the story behind all stories. And as Lewis heard this, he thought this was an interesting idea, but he had his doubts, he had his questions. How could he know that particularly this New Testament story of Jesus, how could he know that that really happened? And Lewis decided to go to the most skeptical person he knew, another professor of Oxford who taught history, who Lewis knew was not a religious person by any means. He was an atheist. And Lewis said, look, if anyone's going to convince me out of this Christianity stuff, it'll be this guy. So he sits down, let's say over tea, with this Oxford professor of history, an atheist. And Lewis asks him about the New Testament. Can you really believe this stuff is true? And this professor shocked Lewis when he probably said in an old Oxford crotchety way that the evidence for the New Testament is actually surprisingly good. And this blew C.S. Lewis away. And what I want to just share, the bulk of the time tonight, is what this professor might have shared with C.S. Lewis that changed his mind about the Bible. That changed his mind to begin to take not just the Bible, but Christianity seriously. And which would eventually led to his return to the Christian faith when he became again a follower of Jesus. But I want to start by thinking about, okay, we need to first think about how does history work in general? How do we even approach, what does history do? Okay, I hope there's some Blue Jays fans in here. It is the only team we have in this country now. Does anyone know the name of our mascot? Ace. Nice. You should get a prize. If I had something to give you, I'd give you a prize. Ace is the mascot of the Toronto Blue Jays. Now, where am I going with this? Here's where I'm going with this. Jeremy, because I saw you have that awesome hat, I'm going to pick on you in a gentle way that we'll know isn't actually true. We know Jeremy's a Blue Jays fan, but let's imagine thinking about history. How do we know anything about history? Can you prove anything with history? Well, let's think about it like this. Let's imagine a court scene where Jeremy has been accused of stealing Ace's costume. You know, Ace is not a real bird, it's a guy in a suit. Let's imagine that someone stole the suit, and Jeremy's been accused of stealing this mascot's costume. And the evidence starts being brought up against Jeremy. And let's say the first piece of evidence is this. You know, the lawyer walks up and he says, we know, even though Jeremy's wearing a hat tonight, Jeremy's never been a Blue Jays fan. He's a Yankees fan. Ooh. And let's say that we all are the jury. We might go, hey, even if that's true, nobody's perfect, that doesn't prove anything. He's probably just, that's not enough evidence to put him away. But then the lawyer says, aha, I'm not done yet. Not only is he not a Blue Jays fan, we also know he was at the baseball game the night the mascot's jersey was taken. Oh, well, we might say, that's not enough evidence to prove anything. Yeah, sure he was there, but so what? A lot of people were there. The lawyer says, I'm not done yet. We have security footage of someone coming out of the room, the Blue Jays locker room, where the mascot's costume was in. He was carrying a garbage bag. It was black. We couldn't see what was in it, but it was really suspicious. And we might go, Jeremy's a nice guy. Maybe he's just taking out the trash, for the team. Being a good guy. And I say, all right, well, I'm not done yet. I'm a lawyer. I'm still making my case. And I say, we ended up finding Jeremy's car. And in the trunk of the car, we found that garbage bag with the mascot jersey in it. And on it was scribbled in black Sharpie, Yankees rule, Blue Jays drool, love Jeremy. We still might say, as much as you guys love Jeremy, someone still could have framed this guy. I know, but maybe he's innocent. But the reality is, here's how things work. Any one of those pieces of evidence couldn't prove that Jeremy had done the crime. But when all of them are taken together, suddenly the case begins to be quite strong. And I want to say, it's very similar when it comes to history. When it comes to anything that's happened in the past, we're going to look at archaeology this weekend. We're going to look at some of the things I'm going to talk about. But the reality is, we're not talking about proving things like you can prove 2 + 2 is 4. That's not how history works. What history comes down to is the evidence. And the more evidence you have, the stronger the case becomes. And I want to make the case that I think what this atheist professor said to C.S. Lewis that changed his mind was that there was evidence that just stacked one after the other. Any one of them we might say, that doesn't prove anything. But the case becomes becomes strong when we take it all together. And it's what brought Lewis back to the Christian faith, and it's the reason why many people become Christians today, because of this kind of evidence. What kind of evidence is this? Let's say this professor began with evidence for Jesus and the Bible outside the Bible. Here are 3 historians who wrote about Jesus and the early Christian movement: Josephus, Pliny the Younger, and Tacitus. Now, I've selected these 3 not because they're the only 3, but they're an interesting combination. On one hand, you have people of 3 different ethnicities. Josephus is a Jew, Pliny is Syrian, Tacitus is a Roman. They're from 3 different career backgrounds. Josephus is an aristocrat or a historian. Pliny was a philosopher. Tacitus was known as a politician or a statesman. 3 different ethnicities, 3 different careers. None of them were believers. All of them we see are writing relatively early. We'll come to that in a moment. And I just want to give you a sense of what are these kind of writings that these ancient historians are writing about. Okay, here's what Tacitus writes in his book, Annals. He's talking about how Nero was trying to blame this fire that had burned half of Rome down on Christians. Here's what we read. Therefore, to scotch the rumor that Nero had started the fire, not actually what the rumor was, Nero substituted as culprits and punished with the utmost refinements of cruelty a class of men loathed for their vices, whom the crowd styled Christians. Christus, from whom they got their name, had been executed by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate when Tiberius was emperor, and the pernicious superstition was checked for a short time, only to break out afresh. Not only in Judea, the home of the plague, but in Rome itself, where all the horrible, shameful things in the world collect and find a home. It's modern-day Toronto. I know that's what you guys think about. Tacitus is no friend of Christianity. You can tell that pretty clearly. He calls Christianity a plague. But what's interesting, even in his critical writing, we get some historical things confirmed about the Christian faith. One, there was this guy, Christus. That's the Latin word for Christ. This was a real historical figure, Jesus. He was actually executed. And we even get a name with that, Pontius Pilate. He was the procurator. He's mentioned in the New Testament as well, as is Tiberius, who was the emperor at the time. Then we have even this weird little language about this movement. Something happened that ended the movement, but then something happened that led it to break out suddenly. Something of perhaps even supernatural meaning. From outside the Bible, from texts like these, we can get a sort of historical skeleton of what we can know about Jesus, that he existed, as well as other biblical figures, that Jesus was executed by the Roman authorities, that there was a sudden growth of this Christian movement, something like a resurrection happened, something that even non-Christians are writing about. And Pliny especially speaks about how Jesus was worshipped as a god at a very early date. This was not something new. This is not hundreds of years later. This isn't legend. This is early. But maybe, let's say, we're looking at these dates, maybe we're saying, okay, we're still a little skeptical. Maybe we know Jesus dies probably in the year 30 or 33 AD. That's what historians think. This is 60 years later. You say, I don't remember what I had for lunch yesterday or today. I don't remember anything. How could you remember something that happened 60 years ago? And that's an interesting question. It's helpful to keep in mind that we are actually in the field of ancient history. When it comes to ancient history, long gaps are actually common. Take, for instance, Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great dies in 323 BC. The earliest biography we have of Alexander the Great comes from Plutarch, 400 years later. Historians tend to take that pretty seriously. When you study Alexander the Great in middle school, you probably didn't get told, we really know nothing about this guy at all, it's all a big myth. No, there are some things we know about Alexander the Great. These kind of long gaps in time are quite normal. But maybe you might say, still, maybe it's evidence, not proof. It's still 60 years. That's still quite a long time. At this point, what if I were to tell you that there are actually sources earlier about Jesus than those 3 historians? What if I were to tell you that I think a strong case can be made there are 27 sources that are earlier than these? And these would be 27 books of the New Testament. Did you know that actually the earliest sources we have about Jesus are the books that found their way into our Bibles? Take, for instance, the Gospels. These are the 4 biographies of Jesus. They tell the story of Jesus' life: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The earliest of these, by pretty progressive, liberal, skeptical dating, would be Mark around AD 65. Some people date Mark 20 years earlier than that. But even if we said AD 65, that's 30 years after Jesus' death. That gets us a little closer. It gets us in the range for a historian, for eyewitnesses. These are people who actually were around Jesus, who heard him actually teach, who saw him do miracles, and who were still alive to be able to give their accounts of what really happened, who were still alive to correct the narratives in case there were any errors in it. And furthermore, we might say these were eyewitnesses deeply motivated to do this. And the reason for that is they were dying for their faith. Now, a lot of people today die for religion. And that's a sad thing, and it doesn't prove every religion you die for is true, but what it does prove is that the people who die for their faith really believe it's true. Here were people, eyewitnesses, they were alive. Christians, we even saw from Tacitus, were beginning to be killed. They were the sources of the eyewitness testimony, and they were standing by it. Not just the stories of Jesus' teachings, but that Jesus claimed to be God, that he claimed he would die and rise, and that really happened. 30 years. It's not proof, but it is evidence. But what if we could go even earlier? The letters of Paul are even earlier than the Gospels. 1 Thessalonians, for instance, dates within 20 years after Jesus' life. It's not proof, but it's evidence. But we can go, I think, one step even further. There is a creed found in Paul's letter to 1 Corinthians. A creed is a basic statement of Christian beliefs. A lot of churches still recite a creed every week. And this is a very early creed found in the 15th chapter of this letter. And in this creed are basic statements of Christian belief. I delivered to you of first importance what I also received. Boom, creed begins. That Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures. That he was buried and that he was raised. And that he appeared. Not just to Cephas, not just to the disciples, to more than 500 brothers at one time. There is a scholar named Gerd Ludemann, who's a New Testament scholar. He's an atheist. He is in Germany, and he is making a case at the highest academic levels that this creed dates from 3 to 5 years after Jesus' death. In the field of ancient history, it's hard to get across how mind-boggling this is. We're going 400 years to 30 to 20 to 3 to 5. This sort of thing doesn't happen. It's not proof, but it is evidence. It makes a case. I think this professor might have also turned to talk about manuscripts. Now, I was trying to think of how can we get this relatable today? And I thought about comics. Marvel, DC Comics. Does anyone know when the first Marvel comic came out? Ish. It was 1939. Did you know? DC was 1938, I believe. I was just trying to look this up 5 minutes ago. The most expensive comic book ever sold was for $3.2 million. It was the first DC comic featuring Superman. It was when Superman was introduced to planet Earth. $3.2 million. Why is that so expensive? Well, it was first edition. Where am I going with this? There are some ancient books, let's say comics for now, where there aren't even any first editions left. People have lost them. So you have a second edition. We tend to take that as, well, pretty reliable, still pretty close to the first edition. I'm not thinking the text is changing. When we're talking here about the New Testament, we're talking about comic books, if you will, that are 2,000 years old. Hard to find a first edition. Take, for instance, something that's not the Bible. Caesar. Caesar died in 44 BC. Excuse me, Caesar's biography was written in 44 BC. That's when it was written down. That's the first edition. We don't have any actual physical copies of the writings of Caesar until 900 AD. Now, it's one thing to have a second edition Marvel comic instead of the first. Probably still pretty accurate, but a historian looks at this and goes, that's quite a gap. A lot of things could have been changed. How many editions was that? Number 40? How many copies of a copy of a copy of a copy? How do you know that's the real thing? Historians take that seriously. They have their questions. Historians will also look at the number of copies. We have about 10 copies of the writings of Caesar from around this time, the Middle Ages, 1,000 years after these writings were written down. Historian looks at that and goes, that's a little sketchy. Because if you wanted to change the story of Caesar Augustus and play a prank on all the primary school kids reading about this guy and make it, actually, Caesar Augustus was a huge Marvel fan. You could make that up if you only found a 10. You just have to find 10. Change them, send it back out again. No one would know. Maybe they could tell, but, they're good forgers back in these days. 10, it's not too many. But sadly, this is the case with a lot of ancient books. Take Plato, first edition, writings of Plato, 347 BC. The first copy we have is from, again, 900 AD. This is now 1,200 years later. We have nothing in between. But pretty much, we take the writings of Plato as things he really wrote. We only have 7 copies, though, of what Plato wrote. All right. I think this professor might have mentioned some of the evidence that even in the 1950s and 60s, when Lewis would have had this conversation with him, perhaps even earlier, this kind of archaeological evidence was coming out. The Gospel of John, a skeptical liberal date of the Gospel of John is around 80-90. Not going to be too much later than that. We have a manuscript, an edition of the Gospel of John from 125 AD. And actually that picture there, I did my graduate work in the UK. That's called the Oxyrhynchus Papyrus, and it actually is a copy of the Gospel of John. And I actually got to hold that in between my hands. Actually, it was under glass, but it's like 2 window panes, and you can hold it up and look at it. I was studying basic introductory Greek, and I could hold my Greek New Testament up to this copy of John, and it's the same. It's humbling. But for a historian, they're looking at the time gap. 1,000 years for Caesar, 25 to 50 for the New Testament. Mind-boggling. It's not proof, but it is evidence. Furthermore, when we look at the number of manuscripts, there are 24,000 manuscripts of the New Testament from the first 5 centuries or so of the church. And these are manuscripts not just in Greek, the language the New Testament was written in. They're in Latin, they're in Arabic, they're in Slavonic, they're in Coptic, they're in languages all across this region, which means this: if you wanted to play a prank, not on your primary school class, but on your Sunday school class, and change the words of Jesus, you've got quite a lot of work to do. You have to learn Coptic and Slavonic and all these other ancient languages. You got to find 24,000 copies of these manuscripts, and you have to change them all, and no one can tell, and you have to send them all out again. That's tough. The historian looks at that and goes, that's not proof, but it is evidence. The Bibles that you have, maybe even with you tonight, are based on the earliest manuscripts that we found. These here. It's not proof, but it is evidence. I think one last line of testimony this atheist professor might brought up to C.S. Lewis why you could trust the New Testament had to do with internal evidence. What I mean by this is evidence in the passages of the New Testament itself that suggest this doesn't sound like something someone would make up. Take, for instance, how the disciples come across. If the disciples are making this up to get people to join their movement, they're not doing a really good job. Why? Look at how Peter, the lead disciple, comes across. In Jesus' moment of greatest need, he denies him 3 times. Peter, at one point, is called Satan by Jesus. Come join my movement. I was so close to Jesus, he called me the devil. Not the kind of thing you make up. It's not proof, but it's evidence. Why would that be there? Maybe because it really happened. The disciples often don't understand Jesus. When Jesus rises from the dead, they're not saying, yes, we knew this would happen. No, not at all. It takes Thomas, a physical, personal encounter with Jesus to finally change his mind. I think this professor might have also spoken to Lewis about the role of women in the New Testament. Peculiar. Women all throughout Jesus' ministry had a very important role, but particularly at the end, at the tomb. The women were the first witnesses to Jesus' resurrection. We see this in all 4 of the Gospels. Here are just 3. What's significant about this is Josephus, who's one of these ancient historians, wrote that women's testimony back in this day wasn't seen as valid in any court system. They were seen as untrustworthy. Those were the times. It was sad. Hopefully we've come a long way. But the question then is this: if you were making this up, if you wanted to make people believe that Christianity is true, that Jesus was who he says he was, and that he proved by rising from the dead, why would you base that most important claim on what was seen as the weakest source? Maybe they did this because it really happened. It's not proof, but it is evidence. I think it's this kind of evidence that led Lewis to change his mind, to take the New Testament seriously, not just as an ancient book of myths and legends, but a book that pointed to something at the heart of every story. What I mean by that is this: I think Lewis knew his story so well that he knew that if this was to be really the story behind all stories, it would have to have something in common. And I think something at the heart of most of the greatest stories we tell each other is the theme of sacrifice. This is one of my favorite stories. It's called A Tale of Two Cities. It's written by a guy named Charles Dickens. The story is maybe one we're pretty familiar with. Lots of movies are kind of the same, but it's still pretty moving. It's about 2 guys that fall in love with the same girl. The 2 guys are Charles Darnay and Sidney Carton. They both fall in love with Lucy Manette. Charles and Sidney actually kind of look alike, the 2 guys. But Charles is much the better man. And Lucy ends up choosing Charles over Sidney. Sidney fades from the story. Charles and Lucy get married. They have a child. But then the French Revolution breaks out. Charles was born in France. He has to return. He's an aristocratic blood. He crosses into the country, and if you study this at all, you know, even though this is fiction, Dickens was right. This sort of thing happened. He was arrested right away. He was thrown in prison very soon. He was on death row, and it was the last day before he was going to be executed. right before this scene happens here, that there's a knock on his cell door, and it is Sidney Clinton. The last person he'd expect. It's his old rival for his wife. Sidney comes in, he brings some smelling salts, he knocks Charles unconscious, he switches clothes with Charles, and has Charles smuggled out of prison. Sidney takes his place in the cell. An hour later, knock on the door, this time it's the guard. It's time to go out. The prisoners file out in line to go to the guillotine. And there's a young woman there who's a seamstress who looks at Sidney and recognizes he's not Charles. She had known Charles, and she realized this is not the same guy. And her eyes grow wide, and she asks Sidney, "Are you dying for him?" And he says, "Yes, for his wife and his child." She was facing her own death. And she finds this so moving that she asks if she can hold his hand for strength. This was a sacrifice, wasn't even for her, but it was something so beautiful. She literally wanted to reach out and hold it in her moment of greatest need. And as Dickens tells the story, he says that when Sidney got to this point, up on the scaffold, about to die, if he could say anything, he would have said these words, which you might recognize from a Batman movie, which they came out of. If that's more your jam, then trust Dickens. Here's what Sidney would have said. "I see the lives for which I lay down my life. Peaceful, useful, prosperous, and happy. I see that I hold a sanctuary in their hearts and in the hearts of their descendants, generations hence. It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. It is a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known." C.S. Lewis would say the reason why this story moves you is because it's an echo of a deeper story. A story not just written on the pages of the book, but on the pages of history. And even we might say, in the fabric of reality, there is a story that echoes and makes our hearts get moved by a story like this one. A story that's not just about a sacrifice for one man, one woman, and a man and a daughter, but for all those who trust in him. Jesus, at no point, I think, in his ministry is so clear about his purpose as in Mark 10:45. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. We cannot understand Jesus unless we understand his death. We're thinking tonight about why trust the Bible. I think part of this question is historical. Can we know Jesus said what he really said? Can we know that about the rest of the New Testament? But I think the question behind the question is, can we trust the God behind the Bible? The Bible that he inspired. Can we trust that God? I have a colleague who likes to say, when you're pushed to your limits, the real you comes out. When I push to my limits, when I'm stressed, when I'm tired, often what comes out of me is not that nice. That saying would say, who I am at my worst is the person who I really am. But what happens if we apply that to Jesus? When Jesus is pressed to his limits, when he's abandoned by those closest to him, when he suffers terrible injustice, accused of something he didn't do, when he's physically in pain, when he's far from God, abandoned, what comes out of him is pure love. Among his last words on the cross, Jesus says, "Father, forgive them, they know not what they do." And what that means is this. If Jesus was good on the cross, if he was loving then when it cost him everything, when it comes to your life and mine, when I'm batting my head against what the Bible says about one thing that I'm not wanting to submit to him in, when I'm battling to believe that what the Bible says on some of these hot issues today is actually good news, when God feels far away and I don't know where he is in my life, if God was good then in the person of Jesus on the cross, I can know he's good now. When you're pushed to the limits, the real you comes out. Jesus is pushed to the limits, and what comes out of him is the love he has for us, that brought him to the cross to die for our sins. I just want to follow this thought as I start to close to how this sounds in our culture. We're thinking about how the culture impacts what we believe. I want to think about how what we believe hits the culture. If you were to say to someone, I think that Jesus died on the cross for my sins, probably this person out on the streets who's St. Marie, I definitely know it would be the case in downtown Toronto, they might say, I think that Jesus' death was a wonderful act of love. It was a sacrifice on behalf of his disciples and friends. But this whole idea that Jesus died for my sins, I don't know if I buy that part of the cross. This whole sin part. Jesus took my place. I don't know if I buy that. It was an act of love. Can't we leave it there? But I want to ask, does this make sense? This is your beautiful town. I love how much water is in it. Let's imagine that after this tonight, and it was, I think there's a helpful way to think about this from a pastor in New York City who sort of pointed me in this direction. Let's imagine that after this tonight, a few of us want to go down by the water. And I'm just wanting to spend more time with you guys. I'm thinking, I've gotten to know some of you, and I just care about you guys so much. Let's go spend some time together. We go down and walk by the water, and I start saying, man, I just care about you guys a lot. I just want to show you how much I care about you right now. And I jump in the water. I swim out as far as I can, and I drown. Are you guys going to look at each other and be like, you love us so much? No. You're going to think, who brought this crazy trauma person up here? But let's change the story. Let's say instead of me just swimming out in the water and drowning, one of you fell in, and there was wind, and the waves were taking you out, and I jumped in, and I saved you, but I drowned in the process. Would that be love? See, it changes the story. And in the same way, if Jesus is just some random guy dying 2,000 years ago, in no way is that just an act of love. It's crazy. There's nothing about that should change your life. The only way the death of Jesus makes sense is if we were in a situation of danger that his death has rescued us from. If that happened, then it could be the potential, it have the potential to be something at the center of our lives. I want to show you another landscape here. 5 months ago, I got married, actually today. Aw, sweet. My wife is not here, but I will tell her, I told this story, and hopefully she'll be okay with it. It's fine, it's just how we got engaged. This was the place we got engaged. It was a beautiful park outside of church. And I'm not going to give you all the details of how I did it, though if you guys, if you want some ideas, I'm happy to give some coaching. But what happened, essentially, it's the standard story. At some point, I got down on my knee, and you pour your heart out for this person you want to marry. And you ask them, will you marry? And wonderfully, she said yes. But I think there's something in this worth noting. And it was a colleague of mine who pointed out this to me. This is how engagements work. But there's something deeper in this. Let's imagine that as I poured my heart out to my then girlfriend, and I just told her how much I loved her, all the things I admired about her, and then I asked, would you marry me? It's possible she could have said no. That would have been hard, but that would have been okay. And she did say yes, which is wonderful. But let's imagine that she just didn't say anything. She just sort of just was silent, and kind of just walked away. Ladies, please don't do this. You can say no, but it's hard. Why is it hard? There comes a point where there's such an outpouring of love that it demands a response. And I think when it comes to Jesus, it's something very much the same. We're thinking about, can we trust the Bible? Can we trust the God that inspired that Bible and the God that Bible points to? What I want to say is, when it comes to the person of Jesus, if that really is God himself in the person of his Son, pouring himself out to us, that means it's a kind of extravagant love that calls for a response. We cannot just walk away from this Jesus. You cannot just walk away from the cross. You can tell Jesus no, or you can tell him yes, but we must say something. I think the most vivid scene of this in the Bible comes from the story of Peter. Remember the scene where Jesus calls Peter in Luke's gospel? The scene was this. Jesus had been teaching. He taught the people from a boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we toiled all night, took nothing, but at your word I'll let down the nets." When they had done this, they enclosed a large number of fish, and their nets were breaking. And they signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both the boats so that they began to sink. Something rash poured out on Peter again. Peter can't take it. When Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord. For he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. So also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching men. But here's the interesting thing. They actually followed him. Verse 11. When they had brought their boats to land, they left everything and followed. Peter has been the recipient of this extravagant outpouring of grace, something he didn't deserve, and he can tell it's directed to him, and it's too much for Peter, and he responds. But the question I want to ask is, why does he actually follow this Jesus? It would have been such a risk. Jesus has offered him grace, but why would he follow? I think that Peter in this moment was experiencing a new kind of identity that Jesus offered. Here's what a pastor named Tim Keller says. I think he's just spot on. To be fully loved but not fully known is shallow. To be fully loved but not fully known is shallow because you can always wonder, if this person really knew me, would they still love me? But then he says, to be fully known and not loved is our greatest fear. To have someone see you to the depths, to see the person who you really are, and then to be rejected for what they see. Nothing worse than that. Then he says this, to be fully known and fully loved is our heart's greatest desire. I think what explains the transformation of Peter, and what can explain the transformation of you and me, is that we step into knowing what it is to be fully known and fully loved. Peter's fully known because he realizes Jesus knows the sinful man who he was. But he's fully loved because Jesus didn't say, I got the wrong guy. Peter is stepping into a new identity. Our culture has a lot to say about identity. Identity is something you make for yourself. You decide who you are, and that's who you are. But the deeper kinds of identity are identities that we receive, particularly those in a relationship, those in which we can be fully known and fully loved. Lewis spoke about how when we hear a good story, I don't know if you've ever been in a movie theater, and it's your favorite movie, and it ends, and you were looking forward to it for so long, if it just ends and your friends get up to leave, and you're sitting there watching the credits, and you go, no, wait, I just want to take in this moment. Lewis says this is something stories do to us. He says this, we do not merely want to see beauty, we want something else we can hardly put into words, to be united with the beauty we see, to pass into it, to receive it into ourselves, to bathe in it, and to become part of it. This greatest story about the cross, I want to say as I close, I think is one that invites us to be a part of it as well. When you see something beautiful, don't you want to be a part of it? Do you see the beauty of the cross? Have you wrestled with the extravagant love that's poured out? It's significant that we see what a response to Jesus looks like. How do you respond? Yes, to an outpouring of love from God himself. They followed him. I think there's something significant about this idea of following, because on the one hand, it's something you can do if you're 5 kilometers away from God, and it's something you can do if you have been quite close to him, maybe not recently. What's involved in following, the starting point's always the same. It's a change of direction. That looks the same 5 kilometers away or 5 feet away. And it's a commitment to step forward towards God. I think that's what this story and this person behind the story invites us to. I wonder where this gets you tonight. We're looking at a lot of big questions this weekend, but I think to be a Christian doesn't mean you have all your questions answered. It means you have enough of your questions answered to really see that this is something God really did for you. That Jesus didn't just drown in the lake 2,000 years ago, but that he put himself under the wrath of God for you and for me to the extent that that touches your heart. Will you, like Peter, step into what it means to be fully known and fully loved, maybe for the first time? And you can take that first step to leave things behind and follow him, even if it might come with a risk. George VI was king of Britain during the Second World War. He gave radio addresses that were put in the King's Speech. You saw that movie. The first address he gave was this one. It was one of the most tense points. The war was about to break out. It said that Elizabeth, his daughter, our queen, gave this poem to him. It's a poem he read to an uncertain country, an uncertain world. And I said to the man who stood at the gate, give me a light that I may tread safely into the unknown. He replied, go out into the darkness and put your hand into the hand of God. That shall be to you better than lights and safer than unknown way. Let me close in prayer. Heavenly Father, when we think about the world and our culture and our life experience, it can be hard to feel you're really there, or that you're really good, and that your word is really good. There is so much uncertainty like this bubble. It feels like it's a dark world, Lord, but we just thank you for not just asking us to believe something, but giving us reasons for it. We thank you for not just giving us even arguments, but a story, a true story, written on the pages of history about that story, this person, Jesus, and the cross. Lord, we just pray for ways that we have not been following you. We ask for your forgiveness. For ways that we need to turn towards you again. We look to the cross and we ask that you would touch us with this extravagant love, and don't let us be mute at this outpouring of love you've done on our behalf. Would you help us to respond and to follow you? Thank you for the cross and the good God behind it that we see and presented in your word faithfully. In your Son's name I pray. Amen.